The sleet had soaked through Barbara Ross before the coach crossed the last mile marker, and by the time the chimneys of London began to show as a black row against the morning sky, her chemise clung cold beneath her dress, and her gloves had turned stiff as bark. She sat on the roof bench because the inside seats had gone to gentlemen with seals on their rings and ladies with lapdogs wrapped in wool, and because the fare for the roof was lower by 6 shillings if one carried one's own case and did not complain, she did not complain. The wind found every seam in her sleeves. It drove needles of wet through patched cloth at her elbows. Her boots had leaked since dawn. Each jolt of the wheels sent a fresh chill along her stockings, then up her spine. She held her back straight in spite of it, as if posture alone might keep strangers from naming what they saw. They saw enough. A woman across from her, wrapped in fur and lavender scent, let her eyes travel over Barbara's mended hem, her dark hair pinned without ribbon, and the raw line cut into her palm by the reticule strap. The woman looked away with that quick, practised dismissal reserved for servants who had forgotten their place. Barbara kept her hand closed around the strap until the cut reopened and stung. The coins inside that bag were counted and counted again in her mind. Lodging for 3 nights if she chose the narrow attic room, candles for 2, bread if she did not eat until evening. She had eaten nothing since yesterday morning. When the coach changed horses at Hounslow, the men jumped down first, cursing the mud and stamping warmth back into their feet, and Barbara climbed down last because her knees had locked from the cold. No one offered a hand. One of the guards tossed her valise from the roof as if it were grain and turned away before it hit the ground, the latch held by habit rather than quality. She caught it to her chest. Her fingers burned, then numbed. Around her the yard moved in circles of steam and noise. Harness buckles rang. Hooves struck stone. A boy no older than 12 dragged a bucket that was too heavy for him and slipped on straw gone slick with rain. Barbara set down her own case and reached for the bucket handle before it tipped. The weight cut into her palms. The boy gave her one quick look. Not gratitude, simply exhaustion shared between the low and the overlooked, then ran back toward the stables without a word. A man in a good coat brushed past her shoulder and muttered, "Mind yourself, girl." Girl? She was 22. Once she had danced in rooms where that same man would have bowed before speaking. She lifted the bucket to the trough and poured with both hands, the water slapping her skirt and soaking it darker from knee to hem. No thanks were offered. Not a soul noticed when she stepped back into the rain and took her place again on the roof bench because the whistle had sounded and the coach would not wait for hunger or hurt. By the 2nd hour after sunrise, London's outskirts had thickened into smoke, soot, and rows of narrow houses with laundry lines strung like surrender flags between upper windows. The road grew crowded. Carts of coal, milk wagons, porters with bent shoulders and rope-marked hands. The city smelled of wet brick, horse sweat, and the bitter edge of chimney ash. Barbara's stomach cramped so sharply she pressed her fist against it and breathed through her teeth until the worst passed. A driver shouted at the horses and snapped the reins. The coach lurched. Her shoulder struck iron rail. Pain flashed down to her wrist where the reticule strap had already rubbed skin raw. She shifted and tucked the bag beneath her arm to shield it from pickers at the halt. She knew better now than she had a year ago. A year ago she had still expected fairness to arrive if she waited quietly and behaved with grace. A year ago she had still believed that papers with her father's signature meant protection. She watched a row of bright windows slide past and saw her own reflection for a breath in the glass of a pastry shop. Pale face, hollow cheeks, eyes too large from weight lost where no one saw. Plain, they called her. Plain was the word women in silk used for a face that did not flatter their own. She had no powder, no pearls, no softness left at the jaw. But she still held herself as Mr. Ross had taught her, chin level, shoulders square, spine straight against weather and ridicule. It was a poor kind of armour. It was the only kind she had. The year was 1824, and she had been absent from every drawing-room that once knew her name, absent long enough for rumour to harden into social fact. Her father had died in early winter, coughing blood into handkerchiefs he tried to hide, and before the black crape had faded at the cuffs, Lady Ross had begun her quiet arithmetic of removal. Morning gowns locked in a trunk, maid dismissed for economy, allowance suspended for discipline, letters answered in Barbara's name without Barbara seeing them. Then the journey north under the fiction of convalescence, as if grief were a fever that could be sweated out in someone else's cold house. The household belonged to a manufacturer linked to the very creditors who had circled Ross accounts for months. Barbara sat at a narrow table under a single lamp and copied ledgers until wax burned down to the brass and smoke blurred the numbers. Her knuckles split from ink and lye water. Her shoulders ached from leaning 12 hours over figures that did not belong to her and debts that had swallowed what did. She learned columns by heart, dates, transfers, secondary signatures hidden under routine expenses, funds marked as maintenance that paid for silk, trust disbursements routed through a shell account with no household attached. Her father's hand appeared in older books, sharp and upright. In later pages it vanished. She copied those pages too. At night she slept in an attic without coal, wrapped in 2 shawls that smelled of damp plaster. She rose before dawn to light fires for people who called her companion when guests visited and treated her as unpaid clerk when the doors closed. She did not cry where anyone could see. She wrote in secret instead, a small notebook tucked beneath the mattress, numbers copied a second time in her own careful script. If proof existed, she would carry it. If proof failed, she would still know the truth of what had been done. At last the coach rolled through the city gate and into the broader streets where names mattered. Mayfair was not far, yet it might have been another kingdom. She climbed down at a public yard off a noisier lane because private arrivals cost more and drew eyes she could not afford. Rain had thinned to a hard mist. It settled on her lashes and turned the cobbles slick. A porter offered to carry her case, then withdrew when he saw she hesitated over the fee. She lifted it herself, the handle bit into old blisters. Her hands trembled once, then steadied. She crossed the yard between piles of post sacks and broken crates, while ostlers shouted to one another over the din. A groom shoved a wheelbarrow past her, with no apology. She moved aside and kept moving. At the pump near the stable wall she bent and splashed water over her face, not for comfort but to wash away soot before she entered a lodging house where the keeper would be deciding in the first glance whether to charge her double. The water was so cold her breath caught. She straightened slowly, pinched colour into her cheeks with wet fingers, and retied the ribbon at her throat where it had come loose. Her dress was still thin, her boots still leaked. Her hair escaped pins at the temples and curled damp against her skin. There was no remedy for any of it, only distance to walk and a room to secure before dark. She found the lodging in a narrow street behind a bookseller and paid in advance because women without escort were refused more easily than they were admitted. The mistress of the house counted each coin twice, then pushed a key across the table without meeting Barbara's eyes. The attic room held a truckle bed, a cracked basin, and one chair with a split cane seat. Wind sounded at the eaves as if fingers scraped the slates. Barbara set her valise down and stood very still while sensation returned to her feet in painful waves. She unbuttoned her gloves and saw the strap mark in her palm, red and raised, with one place where skin had broken. She wrapped it in a strip torn from old lining and tied the knot with her teeth because her fingers were clumsy from cold. Then she drew the notebook from beneath the folded chemise in her case and checked the pages one by one. Dry, intact. Her father's copied figures waited in neat rows under her hand. She slid the notebook under the mattress, knelt to wedge it deep where no chambermaid would find it, and lowered herself to sit on the floorboards because the chair would not hold her weight at that angle. Hunger moved again, a low, twisting ache. She drank water from the jug and lay back with her cloak over her shoulders, eyes on the ceiling where rain tapped and tapped until afternoon dimmed into evening. London had not welcomed her. London had merely received her. She had returned with nothing the city valued, and one thing it had not yet learned to fear. She stayed on the floor until the light thinned to iron, and the room became a shape of angles instead of objects, then pushed herself up with one hand on the bed frame because her legs had stiffened in the cold. The boards creaked under her weight. The jug water had settled like stone in her stomach and done little to silence hunger. She struck a match against the wall, cupped it from the draught, and lit the short end of a candle she had bought with one of her last small coins. The wick flared, then steadied. In that narrow yellow circle, her life reduced itself to the things within arm's reach. One valise with a broken clasp, one cloak still damp at the hem, one pair of gloves drying stiff beside the basin, one notebook hidden beneath a mattress that sagged in the centre. She had once lived in a house with 8 bedchambers and 2 drawing rooms, with wax polished into table legs by men who had worked for her grandfather, and silver brought out for supper even on dull weekdays. Mister! Ross had kept account books in his study with the windows facing east, and when she was 12 he had lifted her onto the leather chair and shown her the difference between debt and duty. He had said figures were honest when people were not. He had also said, with the certainty of a father who thought his years were secure, that she would never need to guard herself alone. The memory of his voice had not faded. The body remembered what love sounded like, even after rooms were emptied and doors closed in her face. When the coughing began in his final winter, he insisted it was a chill from riding in rain. By Candlemas, he could not climb the stairs without stopping. By March, he signed papers from his bed and pressed his hand over his mouth when the fit took him, as if modesty could protect his daughter from fear. She had held the bowl. She had changed the linen. She had read aloud from Milton when his eyes ached too badly to follow the lines. Lady Ross stood at the foot of the bed in black silk and rose water, speaking softly to solicitors in the hall, while Barbara sat through the night counting each ragged breath. He died before dawn, with his fingers closed around hers. He left no blessing speech and no dramatic confession, only 3 words spoken once, plain as arithmetic. Trust no kindness. She had not understood them then. She understood them now with a precision that hurt. By the time the church bells somewhere beyond the roof struck 7, the candle had burned low enough to puddle wax onto the cracked saucer, and the old ache in her shoulders returned with the same insistence as memory. Her father had been in his grave less than a month when Lady Ross changed the household tempo as if she were conducting an orchestra and grief were only an inconvenient pause between movements. First came the economies announced in the breakfast room with that composed smile that never reached her eyes. Fewer fires, fewer candles, fewer servants, each reduction presented as necessity, while her own gowns arrived from Bond Street wrapped in tissue. Then came the private removals, Barbara's mourning clothes packed and sealed to prevent unhealthy indulgence, her mother's miniature taken from her dressing table and shifted to a cabinet key she was not permitted to touch, her books, except devotional volumes and one atlas with half its pages torn, her allowance suspended until she proved responsible behaviour. Barbara had asked what behaviour was in question. Lady Ross had lifted one brow and replied, "Your tone." The daughters echoed whatever suited them. Miss Clara Ross, pale and careful, took Barbara's kid slippers and announced they fit better on a proper foot. Miss Imogen Ross borrowed her winter mantle for an outing and sent it back with mud crusted at the lining and one seam split at the shoulder. At luncheon they spoke of Barbara in the third person while she sat across from them and passed the salt. At supper, Lady Ross instructed footmen to clear the fish before Barbara had reached for it, then remarked to guests that poor relations must learn restraint. There were blows as well, always quick and deniable, delivered when no witness of rank stood close enough to question. The back of a hand at the service stair because Barbara had written to an old school friend without permission. Fingers hard on her wrist in the passage because she had asked to see the estate ledgers. Once, in the morning room, a slap so sharp it rang in her ear through evening because she had said my father's study and not your late husband's study. The cruelty was ordinary in its repetition. That was its strength. One deprivation would have drawn notice. 100 small degradations passed as household discipline. Servants saw and looked away because wages fed families. Neighbours noticed and called Lady Ross admirable for bearing financial strain with such elegant composure. Barbara learned to eat fast when food appeared, to hide bruises beneath cuffs, to answer insult with silence until silence became a second skin. She also learned where keys were kept, which lock turned stiff in wet weather, and how long sealing wax needed to set before a letter could be lifted and read without obvious mark. Endurance made her observant. Observance made her dangerous. North came not as a request, but as a decision already copied into ink. The physician's note was obtained without her examination. The carriage was ordered before breakfast. Lady Ross embraced her in the hall where 2 maids and a footman could witness maternal concern, then said against her ear, too low for others to hear, "You will be grateful for fresh air and obscurity." Fresh air proved to be smoke from factory chimneys, beyond a town whose name polite London never used unless discussing wool prices. Obscurity proved to be a 3rd-floor room in a merchant's house where she was introduced as a convalescent companion and set to work at once over account books tied with string. The merchant, Mr. Halberd, had mild hands and cold eyes. His wife kept chapel hours and inventory discipline with equal fervour. They fed Barbara enough to keep her upright, housed her where frost formed on the inside of the pane, and discovered quickly that her script was neat and her sums exact. Copy this. Index those shipments. Stay until the totals balance. She copied invoices by candle stubs until the smell of tallow lived in her hair. She entered freight tallies while carts rattled below before dawn. She reconciled columns where Ross Trust disbursements appeared, vanished and reappeared under new labels that would have looked harmless to anyone reading in haste. Repairs, educational expense, deferred maintenance, widow's annuity. Twice she saw her father's old seal impressed on documents dated after his death. Once she found a transfer routed through an account opened in the name of a deceased steward. She asked no questions aloud. Questions got women dismissed without references and without wages owed. She began copying a second record in secret, page by page, in a schoolroom notebook bought from her own pin money before the journey. Every number she could verify, every date, every signature variant. She hid the notebook under loose boards at night. then moved it to her mattress after one maid began sweeping too thoroughly. Days acquired the shape of labour and concealment. Weeks passed with no letters from London, except one from Lady Ross, instructing gratitude and obedience. Barbara answered with 2 lines, and no complaint, because complaint could be used as evidence of instability. When spring turned to summer, she was not sent home. When summer fell into hard autumn rain, she understood the arrangement clearly. She was not convalescing. She was being erased by distance while her legal claims were emptied at leisure. The year taught her to hold fury without display. It taught her that fear could be folded and put away like linen until needed. It taught her to sleep lightly, to trust figures over faces, and to keep a second copy of anything worth defending. Now, in the attic off the bookseller's lane, with rain tapping at the slate and the candle guttering toward its end, those lessons pressed on her like extra weight stitched into a hem. She crossed to the basin, washed ink shadows and road grime from her fingers, and watched dirty water cloud then settle. Her face in the cracked glass looked older than 22, and steadier than the girl who had left this city in borrowed mourning. The pallor remained. So did the hollows beneath her eyes. Yet there was a line at her mouth that had not been there before, a line made from choosing restraint over panic often enough that restraint had become habit. She untied her boots, peeled off damp stockings, and rubbed warmth into her feet with the corner of the cloak until sensation returned in sharp pricks. She laid tomorrow's dress across the chair despite the split cane, smoothed the frayed cuffs flat, and threaded a needle to catch the loose hem by candlelight so it would not betray her in public with each step. Each small act carried the same claim. She was still here. Lady Ross had wanted disappearance without trace. Society had accepted disappearance without question. Neither had received what was asked. Beneath the mattress, the notebook waited with copied ledgers in her hand, and her father's order between every line. Trust no kindness. Trust proof. Trust memory. She lowered the candle flame with wet fingers, crawled beneath the thin blanket fully dressed against the cold, and lay on her side listening to distant carriage wheels and the nearest scratch of branches on slate. Sleep did not come quickly, but resolve did. When morning opened over London, she would begin with names, dates, and doors. She would call at the one solicitor her father had once described as incorruptible. She would secure duplicates with a bank clerk who owed Mr. Ross an old favour, and still signed his letters with respect. She would move carefully. She would speak only where facts could not be denied. In a city that had found it easy to forget her, she would make herself legible again one figure at a time. A knock struck the attic door so hard the latch rattled in its plate, and Barbara came upright before she knew she had moved, blanket falling to her lap, candle smoke still sharp in the dark. The second blow came at once, not a servant's tap, a summons. She crossed the boards barefoot, fingers already cold, and opened to the narrow landing where a man in Ross livery stood with rain on his shoulders and a sealed letter in his gloved hand. He did not bow. He looked past her into the room, measured its poverty, and let the corner of his mouth shift with practised contempt. "From Lady Ross," he said. "Immediate." Barbara took the letter and broke the seal with her thumb. Rose-water scent lifted from the paper. The handwriting was precise and slanted, each line clean as a cut. "You will depart London by nightfall. You will attend Mr. Pelham, solicitor, at 1 o'clock, and execute the enclosed renunciation of all claim upon the Ross Trust. You will then proceed to Bath under supervision. Refusal will compel me to protect the family name by circulating evidence of your instability and petitioning confinement on medical grounds." She read the final line twice because the cruelty was so orderly it looked almost polite. The enclosed document crackled as she unfolded it. Her signature line waited at the bottom like a trap already baited. The footman watched her face and said, "Her ladyship expects obedience. There is a carriage at dusk." "She shall not have it," Barbara said before caution could tame the words. He lifted one shoulder. "Then she shall have physicians. I was instructed to remind you that your lodging is known." He turned and went down the stairs without waiting for answer, boots heavy on wood, leaving wet prints that caught the weak dawn leaking through the stair window. Barbara stood in the doorway until the house fell quiet again. Her hand had begun to shake. She pressed it flat against the jamb and forced it still. Confinement, hysteria. A woman could be erased with signatures and sympathy, and every drawing-room would call it regrettable necessity. She folded Lady Ross's letter, folded the false renunciation, and tucked both inside her bodice where heat from her skin would keep the ink dry. Then she dressed with swift, clipped motions, laced damp boots, hid the notebook deeper under the mattress, and locked the door behind her, though the lock would not stop anyone determined. The corridor smelled of cabbage and coal dust. Her stomach pinched. She did not stop to eat. By the time she reached the coaching inn yard near the Strand, dawn had not yet cleared the roofs, and rain came down in hard, slanting needles that turned straw to sludge underfoot. She went there because it was crowded enough to lose herself and close enough to the solicitor's district to wait out the hour. Stable lanterns hung low and smoky, throwing circles of amber on wet cobbles. Horses stamped in their traces. Men shouted over wheel hubs and harness chains. Barbara stood beside a post where a lantern hissed in the damp and held her hands near its heat until feeling came back in painful pricks. Her sleeve, already frayed, had split wider at the cuff. Mud dotted her hem to the knee. She could feel the letter against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She was calculating the shortest route to Mr. Fenwick's chambers instead of Pelham's, weighing risk against speed, when a crack split the yard noise in two. Wood gave way. Iron screamed. A carriage at the gate lurched sideways as its front wheel shattered against the stone lip, one spoke snapping free and whipping outward. The horses reared. Someone cursed. Then a child cried out from inside, high and raw, and the cry did what fear had not. Barbara ran. She crossed slick cobbles at a full pace, skirt gathered in one hand, shoulder striking a post hard enough to bruise. The carriage listed toward the broken side. A groom reached for the door and slipped. Barbara dropped to her knees in mud, ducked under the hanging frame, and saw a boy pinned awkwardly against the seat edge, one leg trapped by splintered wood. Rain ran off the chassis and down her neck. Her fingers found the board, lifted, shoved. It held for one breath, then gave just enough. The boy gasped and tried to twist. She braced him with both hands. "Do not move him!" The command came from above her, cut through the chaos, and she looked up into a face she knew from portraits and gossip and silence when his name entered a room. He had dropped to one knee in the mud without hesitation, greatcoat soaked, dark hair plastered by rain, a pale scar at his right temple stark against skin gone hard with cold. Duke Alistair Thorne, Blackmore's widower. The man mothers called dangerous because he did not flatter, and men called ruthless because he did not forgive. His eyes went to the boy, then to Barbara's hands. "Support his neck. Keep him still." She was already tearing a strip from the inner petticoat with her teeth. "His brow is bleeding into his eye. He cannot see. Hold the lantern lower." For a fraction he looked as if no one had spoken to him that way in years. Then he took the lantern from a frozen ostler and lowered it without comment. Light swung over the boy's face. Blood ran from a scalp cut, thin but relentless in the rain. Not mortal. Frightening enough. Barbara pressed cloth to the wound and turned to the child. "You are safe," she said softly. "Stay with me, breathe with me, in through your nose. Slow. Good." The boy's breath hitched twice. His lower lip trembled. He could not be more than 7. He clutched at her sleeve with a hand slick from rain. The Duke's hand settled at the child's shoulder, steady and broad. "Julian," the Duke said. His voice changed on the name, still clipped but lower. "Look at me," the boy tried. His gaze drifted to Barbara instead, and held there, frightened and trusting in the same instant. She kept pressure on the cloth and counted breaths for him under the din. Around them, the yard finally obeyed its own panic and began to organise. Men pulled the team clear. Someone ran for a surgeon. A woman in a travelling cloak prayed aloud. Barbara heard none of it clearly. She heard only the boy's breathing and the Duke's short commands to the servants, as if command alone could force order back into the world. "Blankets now, and clear this gate!" He turned to Barbara. Rain ran from his jaw. "Report his breathing." "Fast but regular," she said. "No rattle, no vomiting, pupils equal." His gaze sharpened. "You know what to watch." "I copied medical notes for a year in a mill town, where men lost fingers to looms," she said, and immediately wished she had offered less. Too much truth invited questions. He did not ask yet. He looked at her torn sleeve, at the blood seeping where splinter wood had scored her forearm, and at the tremor she could not fully hide in her left hand. "Your arm is open," he said. "Your hands are shaking. They can shake later." Something in his face shifted. Not warmth, not ease, only a pause where cold authority met resistance and did not crush it. His mouth moved once, not quite a smile. Then he gave the next order. "Stay with him." The surgeon arrived within minutes that stretched like rope under strain. He was grey-whiskered, brisk and wet to the bone, and he knelt opposite Barbara to examine the boy with quick, competent touches. No fracture to the skull, likely bruising at the hip, a deep cut at the brow needing stitching once dry. Keep him awake through the next hours. Keep him warm. Keep him calm. The Duke listened without interruption, one hand still on his son's shoulder as if he could transfer steadiness by contact alone. When the surgeon asked for clean bandage cloth, Barbara held out the strip she had tied in place and the second piece she had torn but not used. The surgeon took both and gave her a brief surprised nod. "Well done, miss." The Duke heard it. His eyes came back to her, assessing in a way that felt almost physical. "What is your name?" "Barbara Ross, Your Grace." Recognition did not show as shock. It showed as stillness. Everyone in London knew the Ross name. Everyone knew who had vanished from it. A new voice cut through the yard before either could speak again. High, controlled, furious beneath the varnish. "There you are." Lady Ross came across the cobbles in dark blue silk, unsuited to rain, skirts lifted by a maid, perfume absurd in the stable stink. 2 footmen followed at her shoulder, and one was the man from Barbara's door. Lady Ross took in the scene in one sweep. Broken carriage, mud, the Duke on one knee, Barbara blood-marked and kneeling beside a titled child. Her face changed by degrees, calculation replacing anger so quickly it was almost elegant. She addressed the Duke with a bow too shallow for true deference. "Your Grace, forgive this intrusion. My stepdaughter has a tendency toward dramatic entanglements. She is not in your service. We are leaving at once." Barbara rose, every muscle protesting, and faced her. Mud dragged at her hem. Rain slid down her temples. "I will not go with you." Lady Ross did not look at her. She looked at the Duke, voice soft enough to imply confidence shared. "The poor girl has been unwell. Delusions of importance. I am handling it privately for everyone's comfort." Julian made a small frightened sound at the word unwell and reached again for Barbara's sleeve. The gesture was small. It changed the air anyway. The Duke stood in one clean motion to his full height, and the yard seemed to narrow around him. Water ran from the brim of his hat. His expression gave nothing away except refusal. "She remains," he said. Lady Ross blinked once. "Your Grace, this is a family matter. This is my son's matter. He has physicians. He asked for her." Julian did not speak, but his fingers tightened on Barbara's torn cuff. And that was answer enough. Lady Ross's composure thinned. "Miss Ross is unstable," she said. "I have documents." Barbara felt the letter burn against her skin and almost laughed at the precision of the lie. The Duke's gaze flicked to her bodice, where the paper lay hidden, then back to Lady Ross. "So do I," he said. The words landed like dropped iron. Lady Ross's maid looked down at once. One footman shifted weight and stared at the mud. The Duke turned slightly, not taking his eyes from Lady Ross. "Harcourt." A steward in Blackmore colours stepped forward from the second carriage, as silent as if he had been there all along. "Take Miss Ross and my son to Blackmore House," the Duke said. "The nursery suite. Fire lit. Mrs. Davies informed she is temporary governess by my authority until further notice." Barbara stared at him, rain forgotten for a stunned breath. Governess! Temporary! Protection disguised as employment! The command that was all shelter! She opened her mouth to object, because no arrangement this large should be made over her head in a muddy yard, because debt and gratitude were both dangerous, because accepting the Duke's roof might bind her to another power she could not control. Lady Ross spoke first, silk rustling like dry leaves. "You cannot possibly mean to install her in your household." He gave her the briefest glance. "Watch me." The coachman brought the Blackmore carriage round. Harcourt offered Barbara his hand as if she were already under the Duke's protection, and therefore untouchable by ordinary insult. She hesitated one heartbeat, then bent to Julian. "May I lift you?" she asked. He swallowed and nodded. She slid one arm behind his back, one under his knees, careful of the bruised hip, and rose with effort she did not show on her face. He tucked his head against her shoulder, damp curls cold at her throat. As she turned, the Duke stepped closer and spoke low enough that only she heard. "You will bring every paper Lady Ross has sent you." Barbara met his storm-dark eyes. "I brought them already." For the first time he looked directly surprised. It vanished almost at once, replaced by that hard, intent focus that made men at clubs lower their voices when he entered. "Good," he said. "Then do not lose them." She carried Julian to the carriage and climbed in beside him, while Harcourt shut the door against rain and stares. Through the blurred glass she saw Lady Ross standing motionless in the yard, silk darkening at the hem, face pale with a rage she could not spend in public. She saw the Duke beside the broken wheel, one hand braced on the shattered spoke, as still as carved stone while water ran from his coat. The carriage jolted forward. London slid past in wet grey lines. Julian's fingers remained knotted in her sleeve until exhaustion dragged his eyes half closed, and Barbara sat rigid in the dim interior, with a titled child leaning against her, and an ultimatum letter hidden against her heart, travelling toward a house she had never entered, and a life she had not chosen. Yet for the first time in a year, no one had succeeded in moving her where she did not consent to go. The carriage rocked over a rut, and Julian flinched hard enough to bite back a cry. Barbara braced him with one arm and set her other hand against the squab to steady herself. Rain struck the roof in hard bursts. The lane noise dulled behind thick glass. In the dim, she could see the pulse beating too quickly at the child's throat. "Look at me," she said softly. "Not at the window, at me." His lashes were clumped with rain. Blood had dried in a dark line at his temple where the cloth pressed down. He tried to obey and managed for a breath. Then his gaze slid away again, unfocused with pain and fear. "You are doing well," she said. "Breathe in for 4. Hold, out for 4. His mouth trembled around the count. She counted for him anyway. The carriage lurched once more, and his fingers tightened in her torn sleeve with desperate force. She let him hold it. Cloth could be mended. Harcourt rode opposite, knees braced against the swaying face, unreadable. He watched Barbara's hands, the pressure she kept on the bandage, the way she spoke to Julian without panic. At the next turn he lifted the speaking hatch and gave an order to the driver to take the smoother road by the square, longer by minutes, but gentler at the stones. He did not ask permission. He did not need to. He lowered the hatch again and said, "We will arrive shortly, miss." Shortly in London could mean anything. Barbara kept counting breaths and felt the paper hidden at her bodice dampen with her body heat. Lady Ross's threat lay against her skin, while the Duke's command echoed above it. She remains. It had been spoken in public, in rain, before servants and strangers. Nothing Lady Ross did would erase that witness. Julian made a small sound and swallowed hard. "Will Papa be angry?" "No," Barbara said at once. He stared at her, uncertain. "He was afraid for you," she corrected, more precise. "That is a different thing." The child turned that over as if it were a difficult sum. His breathing steadied one count at a time. By the time the carriage turned beneath the wrought iron arch marked Blackmoor, he had stopped shaking. The house rose from the rain like a dark ship run aground. Stone frontage, tall windows with the lower shutters already thrown wide to light. Footmen waited under the portico with cloaks over their shoulders and lanterns in their hands. No one looked surprised by emergency. They looked trained for it. As soon as the carriage stopped, Harcourt was down and opening the door. "Do not attempt to walk him yet," Barbara said, before he could reach for Julian. "His hip took force. Lift from the back and knees." Harcourt inclined his head once, accepted correction without argument, and carried the boy up the steps with practised care. Barbara followed, hem heavy with mud, boots leaving wet marks on polished black and white tile in the entrance hall. A maid gasped softly at the state of her skirt. A second maid looked at the blood on Barbara's sleeve and went white. A woman in plain dark wool came forward from the inner corridor, keys at her waist, silver threaded through her hair in a severe knot. Her eyes took in everything in one sweep and missed nothing. "Mrs. Davies," Harcourt said, "His Grace orders the nursery suite prepared. Miss Ross is appointed temporary governess, with full authority over Master Julian's care until further notice." Mrs. Davies did not blink. "Of course," she turned to Barbara directly. "What does he require first?" "Heat, dry linen, clean water, quiet." Barbara gave the list in clipped order, and servants broke to it before the last word left her mouth. One ran upstairs, one toward the kitchens, one for the physician's room. Mrs. Davies stepped nearer and lowered her voice. "Can you keep him awake until the surgeon arrives?" "I can." "Then come." They moved through a side passage rather than the grand stair, faster and warmer, walls lined with her family portraits, half lost in shadow. Julian clenched his jaw against each movement of Harcourt's arms, but did not cry out. Barbara stayed at his shoulder, speaking to him steadily at every turn. They reached a chamber with a small fire already taking in the grate, and a narrow bed drawn close to the hearth. Someone had thought quickly. Harcourt laid Julian down with care. Barbara adjusted the makeshift bandage and checked his pupils in the firelight. Equal, responsive, good. She exhaled once, slow, and felt for the first time that her own arm stung in earnest where splinterwood had scored it. Mrs. Davies returned with a basin, cloths, and a folded nightshirt. "Surgeon is coming from Bedford Street. 10 minutes, perhaps 12. "Then we keep him talking," Barbara said. She drew a chair to the bed and sat where Julian could see her without turning his head. "Tell me the names of your hounds." He blinked at her through pain. "What?" "Your hounds. All of them, in order of bad manners." A small, startled breath escaped him, almost a laugh, and not quite. "Bramble first. He steals toast." "Good. Bramble first. Next." "Pip. He digs in Mamma's roses." The word Mamma came out quiet, automatic, and then stopped in the air between them, like a thing dropped. His mouth tightened. "You mean what you said," Barbara answered as gently as she could. "Next hound?" He looked at her for a long second, then whispered, "Caesar! He sleeps on Papa's boots." She asked the colour of each one, the shape of each ear, which had once bitten a groom, and then wept for an hour over the scolding. He answered in fragments that grew into full sentences as his breathing eased. When his voice caught, she waited. She did not supply words for him. She let him fight his way through each one and nodded when he found it. The surgeon arrived wet, breathless, and brisk with apology. "Roads are a swamp. Let us see him." He examined Julian under better light, palpated skull and spine, tested the hip, and confirmed what the yard surgeon had said. Cut severe enough for stitches. Bruise deep, but not broken bone. Watch for fever. Keep him roused through the evening. No jolting, no noise, no visitors with perfume and opinions. He nodded once at Barbara's bandaging. "You bought him time." "Will he keep the scar?" Barbara asked. The surgeon glanced at the line over Julian's brow. "A thin one, better than it looked." Julian watched the needle laid out and went rigid. His fingers clawed at the blanket. Harcourt moved as if to hold him down. Barbara put up a hand. "Do not," she said quietly. "He needs one still point, not 3 forces." She looked at Julian. "You may squeeze my hand until my fingers break if you choose, but you must stay still." He nodded with his eyes closed. She gave him her uninjured hand. The first stitch drew a sharp hiss between his teeth. He did not pull away. By the third he was shaking hard, sweat beading at his lip despite the cold room. Barbara kept counting with him under her breath. In for 4. Hold. Out for 4. By the final knot, his grip had gone almost numb against hers. When it was done, the surgeon bound the wound and packed his instruments. "Broth only tonight, and someone sensible in this room." Mrs. Davies said, "Miss Ross will remain." The surgeon's gaze went to Barbara's ruined sleeve, then to her face. "And who tends you, miss?" Barbara looked down, as if surprised to find her own arm marked with drying blood. "Later." He grunted, half disapproval, half reluctant respect. "Later becomes infection if ignored." When he left, the room settled into the small sounds of rain at the pane and fire shifting in the grate. Julian's lashes lowered. His hand still held hers with a child's exhausted insistence. Mrs. Davies sent in broth and willow bark tea. Barbara fed him one careful spoon at a time, waiting between each for his swallow. He made a face at the tea and drank it anyway after she did the same first, taking the bitter taste herself to prove it harmless. Downstairs the house had begun to understand what had occurred. Footsteps multiplied in corridors. A stable boy was questioned twice outside the nursery door. Somewhere farther off, a man argued in a low, urgent tone about replacing a wheel before dawn. Blackmore House moved like a great machine adjusting to sudden strain. An hour later, while Julian drifted and woke and drifted again, a maid arrived with a tray meant for Barbara. Bread, cheese, and a cup of hot milk, steam curling in the dim nursery light. Barbara had not eaten since yesterday morning. Her stomach tightened at the smell. She thanked the maid, broke the bread in half, and set one piece aside. Then she noticed a slight movement at the partially open inner door, where a second smaller bed stood in the adjoining room for nursery staff. A boy in livery no older than 13 hovered there, thin wrists, rain-damp cuffs, watching the tray with fixed hunger before he looked quickly down. He was one of the yard lads from the gate. He had run messages through rain all afternoon and had not been dismissed to table. Barbara held out the untouched half of bread. "Take this!" His head jerked up. "Miss, I cannot!" "You can," she said, "and you will." He glanced behind him toward the corridor as if expecting rebuke from a superior no one could see. "Mrs. Davies says pantry first, then I am saying now." He took it with both hands, whispered thanks, and swallowed too fast on the first bite. Barbara added the cheese, and his eyes widened as if she had handed him silver. He vanished before gratitude could become trouble. She drank half the milk and left the rest for when Julian woke, warm enough to soothe a dry throat. She had no right to feed herself before him. The thought came with no drama. It was simply the old arithmetic of care. At the edge of evening, footsteps sounded in the outer corridor, measured and unmistakable even before the shadow crossed the nursery threshold. The Duke stood in the doorway without announcement, still in the greatcoat darkened by rain, gloves in one hand, the scar at his temple pale in firelight. He looked first at Julian. Only after a long moment did he look at Barbara. "How is he?" "Stitched," she said, rising but keeping her voice low so as not to wake the child fully. "No fracture. Hip bruised deeply. He must be watched through the night." The Duke crossed to the bedside and rested 2 fingers lightly at his son's wrist, counting pulse, in silence. Julian stirred and mumbled, "Papa!" "I am here!" The boy's hand searched in sleep until it found Barbara's sleeve again. He settled instantly. The Duke saw it. His jaw tightened once, not anger, something closer to contained shock at trust, given so quickly to a stranger. Mrs. Davies entered behind him with fresh linen and stopped at the sight. Her expression did not change. She set the linen down and addressed the Duke. "Your Grace, Lady Ross has sent a note requesting immediate audience. I informed the messenger you were unavailable." "Correct," he said. "She also sent a second note for Miss Ross, sealed." Barbara felt a cold line run down her spine despite the fire. "May I see it?" Mrs. Davies produced the envelope from her apron pocket. Rose water again, the same slanted hand. Barbara broke it and read. 2 lines only. "You have overreached. Return at once and sign, or you will destroy the child's future by your association with him." Barbara folded the paper once, then again, edges precise. The Duke watched her face. "What does it say?" Barbara could have lied. She could have softened the threat, concealed her own peril, spared herself humiliation before him and his housekeeper. Instead, she handed him the letter. "It says she means to use your son as leverage against me." He read, without visible reaction, and passed it to Harcourt, who had appeared at the door as if summoned by the change in air alone. "File this with the first," the Duke said, "and instruct the gate that no Ross messenger enters beyond the outer post." Harcourt bowed and withdrew. The Duke turned back to Barbara. "Did you answer any previous communication from Lady Ross today?" "No." "Will you?" "No." He studied her a moment longer, as if testing whether resolve could be trusted when pressure increased. Then he said, "Good." Julian woke fully then, disoriented by pain and lamplight, and saw his father standing over him with that carved stone face London feared. Panic flickered at once. His breathing hitched. Words tangled in his throat. I did not... Barbara reached him first, not by speed, but by instinct. She knelt and took his hand between both of hers. "You did exactly what was required," she said. "You survived. That is not failure." Julian stared at her, then at his father, searching for contradiction. The Duke sat on the bed's edge, a movement so careful it seemed foreign to his own body. "Miss Ross is correct," the boy swallowed. "You are not angry." The Duke's hand settled at the blanket near Julian's knee, not touching the injury. "I am angry at a broken wheel." Julian considered that, then gave the smallest nod and leaned back against pillows. He still did not release Barbara's hand. The Duke did not ask him to. Night drew in fully. Lamps were lit one by one through the house. Rain eased to a fine, steady hiss. In the nursery, time narrowed to breath counts and spoonfuls, and the turning of cloth from cool side to warm. Barbara remained at Julian's side while Mrs. Davies came and went with efficiency that bordered on mercy. Harcourt returned once to report the Ross messenger dismissed, and the gate orders obeyed. The Duke listened without taking his eyes off his son. Close to midnight, when the child had finally settled into true sleep and no fever had risen, Barbara's own body began to betray the day's toll. Her shoulders burned. Her injured arm throbbed in rhythm with her pulse. She stood to fetch fresh water, and the room tilted for a breath before righting itself. She caught the bedpost and pretended she had intended to steady the basin. The Duke was beside her before she heard him move. "Sit," he said. "I can continue." Sit. It was command. It was also concern stripped of ornament. She obeyed this time, lowering into the chair by the fire. He took the basin from her and set it down himself, then looked at the torn sleeve she had ignored for hours. "Show me the arm." "It is a scratch." "Miss Ross." She drew back the fabric. The cut was longer than she had admitted, red and angry where splinter and dirt had met skin. Mrs. Davies clicked her tongue under her breath and fetched clean spirits, lint, and a fresh bandage without being asked. Barbara did not wince as the wound was cleaned. She had spent a year hiding pain, where no one rewarded endurance. She would not begin flinching now because a Duke stood close enough to notice. When the bandage was tied, Mrs. Davies gathered the stained cloths and paused by the door. "Your Grace, shall I send someone to relieve Miss Ross for an hour?" Barbara opened her mouth to refuse. The Duke answered first. "No, she stays if she chooses." Mrs. Davies inclined her head and left. The nursery fell quiet, except for Julian's sleeping breath and the fire's low crackle. The Duke remained standing by the bed, one hand on the carved footboard, his profile cut hard against lamplight. Barbara sat in the worn chair, arm freshly bound, exhaustion pressing at her bones. She had given away her bread, her strength, and her last reserve of caution in one long day. She had not been turned out. She had not been dragged back to Ross House. She had told the truth and watched it be believed. After a long silence, without looking at her, the Duke said, "You fed a servant boy your meal." Barbara went still. She had not known she was observed. "He was hungry." "So were you." "That is not a reason to let him starve in my sight." Only then did he turn his head slightly, enough that she could see the storm grey of his eyes in profile. The expression there was unreadable to anyone who had not spent years measuring danger in small details. It was not softness, it was recognition. He looked back to his son and said, in the same quiet tone, "Sleep here tonight, in the adjoining room with the door open. If he wakes to you." Barbara's throat tightened unexpectedly at the trust hidden in the order. "Yes, Your Grace." He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the latch, shoulders squared as if against weather no one else could feel. "Miss Ross." She rose halfway from the chair. "I do not forget what I see." Then he left the nursery, and Barbara stood in the lamplight with her bandaged arm and the child's steady breathing in the next bed, feeling the weight of those 6 words settle over the night like a seal pressed into wax. She remained where he had left her until the latch settled and the echo of his boots dissolved into the corridor. The nursery seemed larger in his absence and colder, though the fire still held. Barbara drew one breath, then another, and pressed her fingertips to the bandage at her forearm to test whether the throbbing had dulled. It had not. Julian slept on his side with one hand open on the blanket, lashes dark against skin gone pale from strain. She moved to the adjoining room as ordered, paused at its threshold, and kept the inner door wide as he had commanded. No bolt, no barrier. A narrow bed stood there, turned down by some invisible hand while she sat in the chair. A pitcher waited on the washstand. A second candle burned low. She did not lie down at once. She crossed back to the nursery and checked Julian's bandage, then the heat of his forehead, then the line of his breathing. Steady, too quick, but steady. The surgeon's instructions moved through her mind in precise sequence. Keep him warm, keep him awake if he rouses. Watch for confusion, watch for vomiting, watch for pupils unequal. She had learned to memorize instructions the way others memorized prayers. Instructions gave shape to fear. She adjusted the blanket at Julian's shoulder and looked once at the doorway where the Duke had stood. "I do not forget what I see." No man in her world had ever spoken that sentence to protect her. In the corridor, a board creaked. She straightened, pulse lifting. Mrs. Davies entered with fresh coals in a scuttle and a folded wool shawl draped over her arm. "You are shivering, miss," she said. "I am warm enough." Mrs. Davies set the coals down, fed the grate with efficient movements, then held out the shawl anyway. "His Grace did not instruct me to argue." Barbara took it, because refusing would waste both their strength. The wool smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen, house scents rather than perfume. "Mistress, Mrs." Davies looked at Julian, then at Barbara's untouched tray on the side table. "Will you eat now?" "In a moment." The housekeeper's mouth tightened by 1 degree. Not disapproval, only recognition of stubbornness. "A moment has a habit of becoming dawn." Barbara managed a tired, thin answer. "I have known worse habits." Mrs. Davies almost smiled, then remembered herself. "Call if he stirs strangely. I shall be in the passage." When she left, Barbara broke the bread she had saved from earlier into small pieces and soaked them in the cooling milk, so they would go down easily. She swallowed by will more than appetite. Hunger had passed from pain to dullness hours ago, and dullness was dangerous. She forced down enough to keep her hands steady, then drank water and washed the cup herself because idleness felt like risk. Julian made a soft sound and shifted, face tightening. Barbara set the cup down and went to him at once. His eyes opened halfway, clouded with sleep and pain. "Miss Ross?" "I am here. My head hurts." "It will tonight, less tomorrow." She slid a hand beneath his neck, raised him slightly, and offered the water by spoon. Small sips. He obeyed. On the 3rd sip, he caught on the swallow and coughed, frightened by the sharpness in his own throat. "Slow," she said. "No one is racing you." He looked beyond her shoulder toward the shadows near the door. "Papa gone?" "He is in the house." Julian's fingers searched the blanket until they found her wrist. "Do not go." "I shall not." He settled by degrees, breath hitching less with each count she gave him. She stayed bent over the bed until his grip loosened and sleep pulled him under again. Then she lowered herself into the chair rather than the adjoining bed, shawl around her shoulders, eyes on the rise and fall of his chest. By the time the long case clock in the corridor struck 2, each quarter hour had acquired a different sound. Rain on the pane softened from hard hiss to fine ticking. The fire sank and was built up once more. Distant wheels in the square thinned to nothing. Footsteps came and went outside the nursery door with deliberate restraint. Barbara kept watch through all of it, waking from shallow drifts whenever Julian moved. At some point she realized there was another stillness in the room, a presence not announced, not dramatic, simply there. The Duke sat in a straight-backed chair at the far side of the bed, coat removed, shirt sleeves dark at the cuffs from water that had not fully dried. He had taken the position without waking her. He watched his son with his hands resting on his knees, broad and motionless. No papers, no decanter, no visible impatience. She did not know how long he had been there. She only knew that in all the stories London told of him, no one mentioned this kind of silence. She shifted, and the floorboard whispered. His eyes came to her immediately. "You were ordered to sleep," he said quietly. "I did. In that chair. For intervals. That is not sleep. Nor is this, Your Grace." His gaze did not leave her face, so I did not ask for your diagnosis. No, you gave mine. For one suspended beat, she thought she had gone too far. Then his mouth moved once at one corner, that same almost expression she had seen in the yard. "Go to the adjoining room," he said. "Now." She looked at Julian. "If he wakes, I will call you." She hesitated. Old reflex fought fresh order. In every other house she had known, retreating meant surrendering control to people who would misuse it. He read the hesitation as if she had spoken it aloud. "Miss Ross, you are not being removed, you are being relieved." The words hit with quiet force because they named the wound exactly. Barbara stood without argument and moved to the adjoining bed, leaving the door open as instructed. She did not undress. She lay on top of the blanket with the shawl around her and one hand curled at her bandaged arm. Through the doorway she could see the outline of the Duke in profile, carved by lamplight, still as the portraits in old halls. Her eyes closed, despite herself. She woke to a small cry and the scrape of wood against wood. Not loud, urgent. She was on her feet at once, crossing the threshold before full thought returned. Julian had half risen and then recoiled from pain, breath breaking in quick bursts. The Duke had one hand at his son's shoulder to steady him, and the other reaching for the water that stood beyond his grasp. "Light-headed," the Duke said to Barbara without looking up. "He sat too quickly." Barbara was already at the bedside, supporting Julian's neck, pressing him back against pillows 1 measured inch at a time. "You are safe. Keep your eyes on me." Julian tried. His pupils tracked, then drifted. His pulse fluttered wild under her fingers. "Breathe in with me," she said. 4, hold, out." He fought for the rhythm. On the second count, his stammer caught hard in the middle of a plea. Do not leave. I'm here." The Duke handed her the cup. Their fingers touched briefly, both cold. "What do you need?" Cool cloth, fresh lamp, and no one crowding him. He moved at once, crossed to the basin, wrung a cloth, returned and gave it to her. No command this time, no correction. Only precise assistance exactly where she asked. Julian leaned into Barbara's hand as she laid the cloth at his nape and continued counting. The tremors in his breath eased after a minute, then another. The panic left by degrees. When the child finally drifted down again, exhausted, Barbara remained bent over him longer than necessary, as if her body did not yet trust the calm. She straightened slowly. The room tilted at the edges. She set a hand on the bedpost and waited for the floor to steady. The Duke watched the movement with a surgeon's focus. "How long since you ate a full meal?" "It does not matter." "It does. I had bread earlier." "How much?" She did not answer quickly enough. "Half," he said, "and milk." Barbara looked at him sharply. "You were watching." "I observe my house." She might have argued. She might have hidden behind courtesy. Exhaustion stripped both away. "I was occupied with your son." "And you will remain occupied, which requires strength." He stepped to the door and opened it a fraction. Harcourt appeared almost instantly from the corridor, as if the house itself anticipated the Duke's hand on any latch. "Kitchen," the Duke said. "Broth, eggs and tea. For Miss Ross. Immediately." Harcourt inclined his head and vanished. Barbara lowered her voice to avoid waking Julian. "Your Grace, this is not necessary." He turned back to her. "It is. Household gossip will make sport of it by breakfast." "Then breakfast will be uncomfortable for them." She held his gaze. "You cannot silence every mouth in London." "No." He took one step closer, not threatening, only absolute. "I can silence this house. I can set terms at my gates. I can decide who is permitted near my son. Those powers are sufficient for tonight." The words were plain. Their meaning was not. Barbara felt a tightness in her throat she did not welcome. Protection had always arrived in her life as transaction, never as declaration. She said very carefully, "If you shelter me, Lady Ross will strike harder." His answer came without pause. "She has already struck." "That is not all she can do." His expression sharpened, the scar at his temple whitening as his jaw set. "Listen to me, Miss Ross." She did. "No physician enters this house to name you unstable. No solicitor enters with papers for your signature unless you request him. No messenger from Ross House crosses the outer post. If Lady Ross wishes to reach you, she does so through my steward and in writing. If she attempts otherwise, she answers to me." Each sentence landed like a bolt dropped into place. Not courtesy, not temporary convenience, terms. Publicly enforceable inside the world he ruled. He continued lower. "This cannot be mistaken. You are under my protection while you serve here. No one will move you by force." Barbara had no immediate reply. She had asked for facts all year and had been fed threats. Now facts were being offered with rank behind them, and relief felt perilously close to grief. A knock came. Mrs. Davies entered, carrying a tray herself, steam curling from a covered bowl. She set it on the side table, without comment on the hour, then looked between them once, reading a current she chose not to name. "Master Julian?" she asked. "Sleeping?" Barbara said. "Good. Then Miss Ross will sit and eat while it is hot." Barbara began. "I can wait." Mrs. Davies interrupted with quiet authority sharpened by long service. "You can sit." The Duke did not speak. He merely held the chair back with one hand until Barbara yielded and lowered herself into it. The broth smelled of chicken, thyme, and pepper. Her stomach woke all at once, painful in its insistence. She took the spoon with fingers that were less steady than she had believed, and managed 2 mouthfuls before heat hit an empty body too fast. She paused, eyes closing briefly. "Slowly," the Duke said. She obeyed. Broth first, then soft egg on bread, then tea strong enough to lift the fog behind her eyes. She had forgotten what immediate warmth felt like when it reached the centre of the body instead of merely hands near a fire. Mrs. Davies took the emptied bowl and withdrew, satisfied. Harcourt's steps retreated down the passage. The nursery returned to hush. Barbara set the cup down. "Thank you." He inclined his head once, as if thanks were irrelevant to logistics. Yet he did not move toward the door. She looked at him across the sleeping child. "You should rest, Your Grace." "I am resting." "This is vigilance." "It is both." He resumed his seat by the bed, hands again on his knees, gaze on Julian's face. Minutes passed, then more. He did not shift except to adjust the blanket when Julian stirred. He did not summon brandy or secretary or distraction. He simply remained, body held in a control so complete it looked like pain translated into discipline. Barbara sat in the chair opposite and watched him in the low light, careful not to be seen watching. The stories about him had never included fatigue. They had never included this unguarded refusal to leave his son's side, or the fact that he took orders from a woman he barely knew when that woman's orders kept the child breathing evenly. Cold men were often praised for control. This was not that. This was fear mastered minute by minute, because panic would frighten the boy. At last Julian shifted, sighed, and settled deeper. No fever, no new distress. Barbara let her shoulders ease by a fraction. The Duke noticed anyway. "You may sleep again," he said. "I can keep watch." "You have kept watch," she hesitated. "And you?" He looked at his son, not at her. "I will not move." The sentence was simple and final. It carried no dramatics, no plea, no invitation to witness tenderness. It was merely true. She believed it at once. Barbara rose, adjusted the shawl, and paused at the threshold of the adjoining room. She looked back once. He had not shifted. Lamplight cut a hard line along his cheek and caught silver at his temple scar. His hand rested open on the coverlet within an inch of Julian's wrist, close enough to reassure without waking, a distance measured by a father who had learned caution the cruel way. She lay down with the door open and listened to 2 breaths in the dark, one child's, one deep and steady from the chair beyond. The house around them settled toward dawn. No one came. No new order broke the quiet. When sleep finally took her, it took her inside the certainty of his words, and that certainty could not be taken back. At dawn, she woke to the smell of lamp oil and cooled ash, and when she crossed the threshold in her stockings, the Duke was still in the same chair, one hand open on the coverlet near Julian's wrist, eyes shadowed but alert, as if the night had not moved him at all. Julian slept without fever. The cut at his brow remained clean. Barbara touched the child's forehead, then looked at the Duke, and the question she had not asked in the dark came out plain. "How long?" "Since 2, he said. "It was nearly 8. Mrs. Davies entered with fresh linen and stopped when she saw them both standing over the bed, like sentries at a border. "Master Julian may sleep another hour," she said. "Miss Ross, Harcourt has returned from your lodging. He waits below with a parcel." Barbara's pulse lifted. She had not asked aloud. She had only told Harcourt, in the corridor before dawn, which attic room and which mattress seam. She followed Mrs. Davies downstairs to a small morning room, where Harcourt stood beside a table. On it lay her notebook, wrapped in plain cloth, dry and intact. Beside it sat 3 folded letters tied with black thread, Lady Ross's ultimatum, the second threat from Blackmore's Gate, and the false renunciation with the signature line still blank. "I took the liberty of asking the lodging mistress whether anyone else had entered your room," Harcourt said. Barbara untied the thread and checked each page in the notebook by touch and sight. "And?" She reported one visitor after midnight, a man in Ross livery. He was denied. The Duke had entered without sound. "Name." Harcourt gave it. The same footman from Barbara's door. "Noted," the Duke said. "Statement. Taken and signed by the lodging mistress." Barbara looked up sharply. "You had her give sworn account." "I had her account witnessed," he said. "Mr. Fenwick arrives within the half hour. You said he was the solicitor your father trusted." The words struck with quiet force. He had listened in the yard, in the nursery, in every place she thought her fear had sounded like noise. She set her palm over the notebook once, as if to steady years of anger into usefulness. By the 3rd week of January, London had begun to thaw at the gutters, but that morning the sky was iron and the windows sweated cold. Mr. Fenwick came in a plain black coat and read fast, lips thinning line by line as Barbara laid out what she had copied in exile. Trust disbursements routed through the dead steward's account, duplicate seals impressed after Mr. Ross's death, maintenance entries that matched silk purchases and private carriage invoices, dates aligned with the month she had been sent north to convalesce. The bank clerk arrived next, summoned by Harcourt, carrying Ross ledgers held on deposit and stamped duplicates of transfer slips. He confirmed signatures, account numbers, and one non-trivial anomaly. 3 transactions executed with an obsolete seal matrix retired the year before Mr. Ross died. Fenwick placed both hands flat on the table. "Miss Ross, this is sufficient for emergency petition. We request immediate magistrate review and asset restraint by noon." The Duke said, "Do it." Fenwick hesitated once. "There is an additional concern. Lady Ross has circulated private notes questioning Miss Ross's mental stability." Barbara felt heat rise under her skin, old shame and new fury in the same breath. Fenwick continued, "I have obtained 2 of those notes. Their phrasing matches the confinement threat in your hand. This supports malice." The Duke's jaw hardened. "File them." All morning the house moved on divided purpose. In the nursery, Julian woke, drank broth, and submitted to fresh dressing with grim bravery that made Barbara's throat tighten. In the study, signatures were taken, affidavits copied, seals pressed in wax while coals snapped in the grate. Barbara signed her own statement without tremor. Harcourt signed as witness. Mrs. Davies signed that the second threat had been delivered at Blackmore and read in her presence. Every item was logged in Fenwick's clerk hand. Notebook original, 2 threatening letters, false renunciation, lodging witness statement, bank duplicates, seal comparison, physician note confirming Julian's injury at the yard and Barbara's immediate aid. At dusk, a messenger from Lady Winchell arrived to confirm the winter assembly would proceed. The Duke took the card, looked once at Barbara, and said, "You will attend." She should have refused. The thought lasted one breath. Hiding had been Lady Ross's strategy from the start. "Yes, Your Grace." Lady Winchell's ballroom blazed with candlelight and polished mirrors, silk and velvet and jewels like chipped ice. Music moved in stately measures under painted ceilings while London watched itself being watched. When Barbara entered on the Duke's arm, conversation did not stop at once. It fractured, then thinned, then fell away and in pockets across the room. She felt every glance land on her plain dark gown, on the healed scrape at her forearm, where lace could not fully hide it, on the fact that she had disappeared for a year and returned beside the man no one approached carelessly. Julian stayed near the supper alcove with his tutor, pale but upright, the new line at his brow visible in candlelight. Barbara crossed to him when she saw his hand begin to shake around a lemonade glass. Lady Ross reached him first. Rosewater announced her before her voice did. "My poor boy," Lady Ross murmured, bending with rehearsed sympathy. "Such a burden, to be coached by women who trade tears for advancement. Tell the truth when you're asked." and this discomfort ends. Julian's mouth locked. His stammer caught hard at the first sound. Barbara stepped between them, shoulder squared, pulse hammering. "You will not speak to him?" Lady Ross straightened, smile untouched. "Miss Ross, you forget where you stand." "I remember exactly." "Then remember this. Children repeat what adults instruct." Julian's fingers dug into Barbara's sleeve. She lowered her voice for him alone. "Breathe with me. In for 4. Hold. Out for 4. His breath broke twice, then found rhythm. Lady Ross watched with narrowed eyes, then turned as if to glide away before anyone marked the scene. A shadow moved at the doorway. The Duke had seen all of it. He crossed the distance without haste, which made the room around him clear like water around a ship's prow. "Lady Ross!" She pivoted with flawless courtesy. "Your Grace!" "You are done speaking to my son." The line was quiet. It carried to the far wall. Lady Ross laughed softly. "You mistake concern for interference. I was offering comfort." "You were offering coercion." Heads turned. Fans stilled. The orchestra faltered, recovered, and then played on too brightly. Lady Ross's eyes cut to Barbara. "This woman has manipulated your household and now your child. She hunts rank as she hunted pity." Barbara felt the old instinct to shrink, to lower her head and survive by silence. It passed. She turned to Mr. Fenwick, who stood near the card room with a leather case in hand, and nodded once. "Now," she said. Fenwick approached with a magistrate in plain evening black, a severe man with ink on his cuffs who had left his own supper cold to answer emergency petition. Harcourt came behind them with the sealed packet. Barbara took it, broke wax, and laid the contents on a gaming table beneath the chandeliers where every eye could see. Copied ledgers in her hand and the corresponding bank duplicates. Her father's original seal from Fenwick's custody. Transfer receipts dated during her forced exile. Lady Ross's confinement threat. The forged renunciation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "These entries divert Ross Trust funds through a shell account opened in a dead steward's name," Barbara said. "These signatures are impressed with a seal matrix retired before my father's death. These letters threaten confinement if I refuse to surrender claim. This renunciation was delivered under coercion." The magistrate reviewed in hard silence while Fenwick identified each item and witness. The bank clerk confirmed numbers. The lodging mistress, trembling but resolute in borrowed gloves, repeated her statement about the midnight attempt to access Barbara's room. The footman's name was read aloud. No one in the ballroom looked away now. Lady Ross's composure cracked at last around the eyes. "You cannot adjudicate family property in a ballroom." The magistrate lifted his head. "I can issue interim restraint where fraud risk is immediate. I do so now." He turned to the constables waiting at the entry, summoned before the first dance. "Serve order on Ross House tonight. Guardianship over Miss Ross's trust is suspended pending full hearing. Lady Ross is to vacate principal residence by morning and submit all account books and sealed devices." A murmur moved through silk and wool like wind through reeds. Lady Ross opened her mouth, closed it, and for once had no line prepared. The Duke stepped beside Barbara, face pale with a fury so contained it looked like stone under frost. He spoke to the room, not loudly, and every person heard. "Good. Then London may look carefully. I will marry Miss Ross, and no one will touch her name again." For one suspended breath Barbara could not answer, because the world had finally gone silent around her, instead of over her. Then she lifted her chin and said, clear enough for the gallery, "Yes, Your Grace, I accept." Spring came to Blackmoor with wet light on the lawns and crocus at the south wall. In the solicitor's office, Barbara signed final restoration papers, while Fenwick read each clause aloud. Stolen funds returned to her control, trust governance transferred to independent trustees of her choosing, Lady Ross placed under legal restraint from any private contact. Barbara selected Mrs. Davis's nephew, a barrister of good standing, and Fenwick himself as trustees. She declined pity, accepted precision, and kept copies in her own cabinet. At Ross House, now leased to another family, no one spoke Lady Ross's name above a murmur. Clara married into the country and wrote once, a thin note asking reconciliation without apology. Barbara sent a civil refusal through Fenwick. Imogen never wrote at all. The footman who delivered the threats was dismissed, questioned, and noted in the magistrate's file. His statement changed twice and was marked unreliable. On a mild afternoon in June, in the nursery at Blackmore, where windows stood open to clipped yew and distant rook calls, Julian sat at a small table sounding out lines from a history primer. He stumbled, stopped, breathed in for 4, held, and finished the sentence. Barbara, now Duchess of Blackmore, marked his progress with a pencil and looked up when he tugged her sleeve. "Mamma Barbara," he said, testing the title with shy certainty. "Did I do it correctly?" She set down the pencil and touched his hair back from the healing scar. "You did." At the door the Duke watched them with that same disciplined stillness he had worn through the night of the accident, only now his mouth moved once at one corner, and this time the smile arrived enough to be seen. The house held. The papers held. Her name held. No one moved her again.